Right, so I'm going to try and string together some thoughts. It kind of makes sense in my head. We'll see how we do. And I'm going to try and intersperse it with a couple of episodes of noise making, which may be foolish. So, according to my abstract, I came away from the meeting in Brighton having noticed that one set of questions kind of formed an attractor around the topic of where we're finding the machine in machine listening and where we're placing the human. And another set of questions, some of which were my fault, were about what contribution artistic research could make to the overall endeavour of humanising algorithmic listening. I'm going to attempt to link these two things up with some segues. I'm not even going to read that out. Some of you have seen it before from a grumpy talk I gave about agency at Tom and Paul's interagency symposium in Bournemouth. And in a way, what I'm about to say is a continuation of the same grump. What I noted during that talk was that when we've been importing the word agency, particularly into kind of NIME-like conversations from different disciplines, we've done it in a number of different ways, and we haven't necessarily stopped to think about the very different meanings of the word agency that we're being made to do work. What I want to address here, and I guess this point that Andrew Feenberg, who's a philosopher of technology, by the way, is making, comes back to some of the ideas people have already said today about finding yourself moving in sympathy with the needs of your algorithm rather than vice versa. Obviously, our ideas about what makes human and what makes machine aren't independent. They co-define each other, and they do that continuously throughout history. So we can't sit down and burrow away about the idea of the human without thinking about the idea of the machine, particularly not in light of the fact that for certain periods of history and in certain places there's been some overlap, i.e. humans have been treated as machines in certain contexts. And of course, quite a lot of the discourse around what we do at the moment tends to humanize technologies in certain ways. We might give them agency, we might talk to them as if they were agental feeling bodies. And one of the reasons for drawing that up is I think we need to be careful not to elide, on the one hand, humankind and personhood, and on the other hand, machine kind and technology. There's quite a lot of substantial overlap there, but they're not completely identical with each other, which is a thought to sort of kind of hold in mind going forward. Here's George Lewis saying a fairly similar thing to Andrew Feenberg. I'm pretty sure most of you will have read that. So, I'm probably more immediately concerned for the next couple of minutes with how it is that we make human listeners than machine listeners, if I remember the order of my slides. Oh no, I'm not. I had a segue to make before I got concerned with that, which was that one of the things I was railing against in Bournemouth, and I'm going to continue to rail against, is the preponderance, particularly from technical colleagues when we talk about machine listening, for the idea that the interesting projects are about replacing human behaviours, like music. I still don't know why it's musically interesting in and of itself to have a computer completely remove social humans from the whole business of music. I still don't know why it should be intrinsically musically interesting to listen to a computer composition, other than the fact that you've gathered around it as social beings to do that. Because I'm very much of the opinion that when we music, we're doing something communicative. We're doing something between communicating beings. That, for the time being, is the kind of distinguishing feature between stupid box, clever box. Now, this tweet from Alex, who does a lot of work on sort of visual style transfer stuff, was in response to a blog post by someone who works in radiology, no less, claiming that there was no such thing as augmentation. It was all automation. Every time we thought we might be using things like machine learning to augment human capacity, we were absolutely wrong. This was all automation, and soon we were going to live in a happy utopia where boring burdens like making music will be taken away from us by the machines. And I thought that was just such a good response by Alex that it had to be shared in screenshot form. One of the things I noticed whilst doing kind of displacement activity reading instead of preparing my talk was that loads of sort of interactive system papers and machine listening papers around NIME and orbiting conferences start with some kind of appeal to biology or neurology or something as a way of justifying an approach that might not even need justifying. And these happen at all kinds of scales. And I think there might be some really interesting kind of literature review work to be done on the different kinds of appeal to biology that people make and the reasons that they make them for. Of course, within certain kinds of computational neurology, people are really, really, really into very small details of how it is that actual neurons in the head might be interacting with each other, down to sort of inhibitory bursts and measuring very small delay times in spike trains on the one hand, and right at the other end of the spectrum somebody might say, oh, and we use decibels on this knob because ears. But actually quite a lot of the times it's sort of like, well, because there's a biological justification behind it, it must actually no longer require any kind of aesthetic discussion. But also people make very strange assumptions about the way that humans might work. And here is one, if read uncharitably. I'm not sure that's true, frankly. It might be, but I'm not sure there's actually much evidence for it. I've never consciously actually built a grid in my head and used that as the basis of my experience of rhythm. It may well turn out to be that that's what we do, but I don't think there's actually evidence for it yet. And it didn't seem like that was a claim that needed to be made in order to discuss an algorithm for beat tracking. So I thought it was interesting. Right, finally to the point I said I was going to make 3 or 4 minutes ago. What, I thought to myself, do we actually do when we've got some humans that we want to get better at listening? So I thought about what we do to my long-suffering students. So these are postgrads, and each of those 4 things we try and get them to focus on in 2 courses that run in parallel in their first semester. And they're selected deliberately because they're polysemic, multi-scaled, and generally available for us to make up nice stories about as we lecture. But also, you can attach them quite immediately to characteristics of listening experiences. It's not hard to start a conversation with a class about what depth might mean in the context of a listening experience. Likewise, scale. We can immediately relate it to certain kinds of very causal listening. It was interesting, it occurred to me, that actually these are all things that it's incredibly hard to get a computer to really deal with. In the context of writing some software that's supposed to respond to what you're doing. By and large, the stuff that we've inherited prefers clean, monophonic signals. It's not terribly keen on mixtures. And if you do have a mixture, you can do fun things like PCLA to try and tear it apart. But we don't really have a sort of machine listening approach that just deals with mixtures as mixtures. And we certainly don't have many techniques at our disposal for dealing with longer timescales. We're kind of still locked into frames of, I guess, sort of 20 milliseconds up to a second if you're trying to run in any kind of real time before your CPU starts begging for mercy. And actually to find tricks that can let us be musical at the range at which we want to be musical, which is much longer than a second, of course, then we need to, I guess, become creative. First, intermission. Happily, Alice and Chris gave us a kind of good intro to how neat feedback systems are for dealing with all kinds of musical problems. And a lot of the work I've done over the last 10 years or so owes itself in part to Agostino Di Scipio's work and in other part to John Bauer's work. And in a way, my PhD was the kind of vampire child of the two of them. And I thought it would be fun in a kind of really stupid way to try and do a bit of Agostino's background noise study here now, which may well not work because it's a bit of a bugger. So what it requires is a couple of microphones, and one of them ideally needs to go near the source of background noise, but as you can see we're in a very quiet room. There's one up there, but I'm not climbing up there. And one reason why it's an interesting piece from this point of view actually is because, like what Alice and Chris were showing us, it doesn't use anything particularly fancy. He gets a lot of musical action basically out of envelope followers. They're a very particular kind of envelope follower. What he likes to do, you see here, is take a normal envelope follower, which is this leaky integrator, and then wang it into a comb filter with the feedback turned right up. So you get some free gain, but you also get an awful lot of free oscillation. So all of a sudden the thing starts becoming much more shaky. And the basic sketch of this piece, I guess the main action is round here. So following that line there, it's basically an Alvin Lucio fan piece. It's a long delay line circulating through with some extra sugar on top. And the sugar comes from the amount of value that he's able to squeeze out of two envelope followers. One of them drives an automatic gain control, but also generates this phenomenally important variable for the piece based on the envelope crossing a threshold. The consequences of it crossing the threshold are that the signal going into the delay line gets gated, so the dry sound can cut in and out, but it also triggers resampled playback of that sound, which in turn then feeds granulators. So if you never cross that threshold, all you get is a kind of rising tide of noise. If you cross it and never come back again, the whole thing will die out. So actually the whole thing requires achieving a sort of state of dynamic stability. If you set it up at all wrong, it'll just peter out or never grow at all. Furthermore, and to emphasise one of Agostino's key points about this, that it isn't just the software. The piece is always the software in the room with the microphones and the person. He has preferences for how it should unfold musically, which are in practice almost impossible to achieve. And it made me feel much better when I saw it not work for him once as well. The idea is that you can kind of corral it into building up and then staying over this threshold for long enough to empty itself and create this kind of moment of emptiness before building back up again. I very rarely managed to get it to do that. So, I'll see what happens when we press go. I had a really nice version of this, which I did on the radio only 18 months ago, and now the code doesn't work anymore. And Jen won't tell me why. So, that's my relationship with Jen over. I repatched it in good old Vanilla Max. So, I should say, for the first 20 seconds, nothing happens because of the delay line. And then we should hear, hopefully, some stuff gradually building up. And just very quickly, we'll crank that up. Yeah. I'm just taking some safety precautions. Yep, there you go. I don't know why it's making noise, but there you go. those high bursts where you can hear the samples kicking in, I'm not even going to try and perform this thing. My role, if I were performing this, would be to sit here with only the microphone preamps to handle. And the sweet spot is tremendously small. And the sweet spot is partly tremendously small because he goes the opposite way from an appeal to biology and puts an exponential non-linearity on this envelope rather than a logarithmic one. So the window you've got in decibels on your little preamp for finding the point where it's not going to go ballistically one way or the other is incredibly small. So you end up having to make these very, very tiny movements which are deferred in their response by at least 20 seconds. So it's the complete opposite to a normal performance paradigm. You have to be very still and very attentive. And just let this thing build up. And the other point about it, which was one reason for dropping it here in the presentation, is that it is tailored to a form of sound that normally we don't deal with. The whole piece, in sound design terms, is predicated on getting this nice broadband build-up coming through. If you've got recirculating voices, it doesn't work anything like nearly as well, because he chose those particular kind of high resamplings to do, and the particular settings on the granulator to produce nicely separated textures when you're feeding it background, sort of, and not so much otherwise. Back to the slides. So, how long have I got left? 5. I took some of what I learnt whilst banging my head against Agostino's work and wrote this paper several years ago where I was chucking around the idea of playfulness as being a useful one to think about whilst doing research with this sort of stuff. And one of the reasons for that was a slight pushback against some of the slightly po-faced avant-gardery that you can encounter in music departments sometimes, but also that in order to find some musical possibilities with stuff where the kind of the cultural horizon of the technology that's being offered to you can sometimes seem quite fuddy-duddy. If quite a lot of the stuff is predicated on the idea that there are 12 pitches to be played with and no more, then you need to be slightly playful with this stuff to go and find some exciting naughty things to do. And one way in which I did this is in a piece called And Now for Some Music. The title from that comes from a possibly apocryphal moment on Radio 3 where the announcer said that was Stockhausen and now for some music.
Wishart. Trevor Wishart.
Was it Wishart?
Yeah.
Right. Right. It was Dick Witts that told me it was Stockhausen, but Trevor's even better. There's really kind of what it does, but that's a really boring overview. So, one of the ways in which it's playful is the whole piece is really an obsession with pitch tracking and making it go wrong. So, I've got a pitch tracker in there which is an overlap add pitch estimator. So it decides something is either pitched or it's noise, and then if it thinks it's pitched, it tells you what pitch it thinks it is. It turned out to be an interesting way of getting pushback and variety and dance off the piece if you made sure that couldn't settle down. So rather than setting a threshold at the beginning of your performance or as a composition thing, you make that something that dances around a bit, so you've got something to think about. And it does that in a fairly standard way, just using a feedback loop, which basically manufactures an error signal. So it's constantly driving itself out into new equilibriums. And the practical result of that is obviously sometimes you're doing something very pitched and very angelic, and it gets treated as noise, and vice versa. You might be doing something horrible and you decide it's pitched. You can take a sensible idea and make it silly quite easily. From the autocorrelation onwards, that's quite an orthodox approach to beat tracking. But normally you'd feed it a sensible signal that made some attempt to track onsets in the source. Instead of doing that, you can just take your source material and downsample it enormously. I find a factor of 2048 with no pre-filtering works quite well. And what that gives you, instead of a monotonic track, is it gives you a free jazz drummer. Without actually having to do too much DSP work, you get something that actually feels musical in some way, as it's correlated with what you're doing in some hard to describe way, so it's better than random, but still it's dancing around you. And I guess the thing that follows from that is, if anyone's read Tiger Roholt's book on groove, this is similar to an argument he makes there, but the idea is that the groove doesn't come from the pulse. Groove is something we experience as we start, and that we're fundamentally going the wrong way if we start describing it as deviant. Take a sub-band algorithm, just do it in one band. Who needs all those sub-bands? This is Risto Hopalinian. He did a really nice set of time domain algorithms for spectral flux, but they were still using a filter bank, which frankly I thought showed insufficient commitment, so I got rid of the filter bank. And again, you get something interesting. So it is generating something like an onset train, but it's a very, very idiosyncratic kind of onset train, because essentially you're trying to make a fairly simple algorithm and do something with a very, very messy signal. Aim too high, yeah. So this is actually, this is a more recent thing. This is from an installation we were working on last year. You've got an installation piece, it needs to run for a couple of weeks, so you've got the problem of how to generate a piece with a 2-week form. And the particular thing here was, well, this thing's recording out of its environment. If our baseline is better than random behaviour, then it needs some relatively principled way, and I say relatively, to decide when it's going to make a recording. Gates, been there, done that. Can we make something that feels like it's a bit correlated to what seems interesting, or at least can it come up with an idiosyncratic sense of what it thinks might be interesting? So I took some perfectly well-written code by Chris, ported it over to Max, and basically take some representation of the audio. I was using Melband, which seems in retrospect to be unduly conservative. You feed it into this neural network, but you don't train the network. You just take the raw states, and then you try and do some clustering on those. And if you're in a fun mood, you choose a clusterer that can't actually handle the number of dimensions that you're feeding it, so its performance starts to deteriorate quite seriously, and it comes up with funny clusters. And again, it worked in a surprising way. It would record at times that did seem like something odd was going on because it thought it hadn't heard it before. But it would also make very strange decisions sometimes about what it thought was interesting. So there's the sort of playfulness there. How am I doing for time, Paul? I'm about to run out, aren't I? Yeah. Punchline. Gets me to my final point. Out of this playfulness, I think there is room for a kind of agonistic exchange in a proper cross-disciplinary session with our colleagues who work in technical disciplines. But if I'm going to be grumpy about the kinds of things that are said about and provided for machine listening for music purposes, then the principal thing to do is to be empirical, as John says, and try and find ways of turning these into serious propositions to feed back to technologists and to think seriously about the kinds of technological infrastructure we're using. So, I mean, some of it might relate to getting rid of FFT-based things altogether because they're slow and dull. Some of it might relate to shutting down possibilities for exploration a lot less. Especially because, and in completely explicit tribute to John Blacking, who's a Queen's Belfast man. The more we foreclose interface, the more we foreclose the chances for people to organise themselves on their own terms and when they're organised down. So I think the great promise of some of this machine listening stuff is for reinscribing relationships between symbol and sound and letting people find their own ways of doing that.